O Quadichas, O Hegwood Twatil, Achas, Altiswa Tuftwood, Atil Poyalapabs, Atiduf A Tiswa Tufted, Atil Poyalapabs, a Slaslel to Altudi to Hak. Didit A Hogwa, Altislachel. The was Slaslels Hogwa, Gwog Yayus Hogwa, Gwog Achwad Hogwa, Tish Badadas, Gwotech Duf Hogwa, Tish Ishads Hogwa, Gwog Ala Los Hogwa, Gwog Toshot Sidab, Chalab Tish Tu Yot Yalabs. Symphony Tacoma gratefully honors and acknowledges that we rehearse, perform, practice, and rest on the traditional lands of the Puyallup people. The Puyallup people have lived on this land since the beginning of time. They are still here today. They live, work, raise their children, take care of their community, practice their traditional ways, and speak the Twoshutsi language, just as their ancestors did.
Hi everyone, I'm Karina Barn, Executive Director with Symphony Tacoma. Thank you so much for joining us for our November Music Mixer. Now before I turn it over to Greg, please help me thank our concert sponsors. Multicare, Tacoma Creates, Pierce County AIDS Foundation, Johnson Stone and Pagano, the University of Puget Sound, Ken Walker Jewelers, and the Musicians Local of Seattle. I hope to see you at the Pantages on November 20th at 7:30 p.m. Thank you and enjoy.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Greg Youtz, and as usual, it's my delight to share some ideas with you ahead of the upcoming Symphony Tacoma concert, which we know is on Saturday evening, November 20 at 7:30 p.m., and hallelujah, it's in the Pantages live. So join us there. But this evening, we're going to give you a few ideas ahead of the concert to think about, maybe some YouTube searches to go look for, to educate yourself before we meet at the Pantages. And I am joined today by two very special guests who are going to help us understand some of the very special history and information around the first piece on the program, which is the Symphony No. 2 by Joseph Bologne. Here to help me understand Mr. Bologna and his symphony and the times in which he composed these are University of Washington and University of Puget Sound professor Kim Davenport.
Thank you.
And Kim, I'm going to let you introduce our very special guest this afternoon, and this is Mr. Joshua Thompson.
Yes, thank you. It's my great pleasure to introduce Joshua Thompson, who is with us here in Tacoma, even though home base is Indianapolis. And I can share a little bit about what brought that to be, that he is in Tacoma. Good timing for this conversation.
I agree, right? We planned this perfectly, did we not?
We did. So during the pandemic, one of the most interesting things that I experienced was people coming together from all around the country and all around the world around common interests. I think that happened in all walks of life, right? But certainly in the world of music.
Yes.
I met many new people who I never probably would have in a different circumstance. And specifically, there's been so much attention, thankfully, in the world of classical music around bringing more light to works by Black composers, finding out more about those stories, bringing that repertoire to new audiences. And that's the context in which I met Joshua over Facebook.
Yes.
We met over Facebook and have been collaborating on Facebook Messenger for the past year, and that's what led to this residency.
Yes.
Coming to the University of Puget Sound to talk to students, give some presentations while he's here. But really what drew me to his work and what led me to believe that we needed to get him here in town was the podcast that he's the co-host of, Melanated Moments in Classical Music. I encourage everyone to check it out. It's fun. It is interesting, it is entertaining, but it's also very educational, especially for those of us in the world of classical music and audiences, people who love classical music. Yeah. So it's all about bringing attention to the music of Black composers. which is a much more vast list of people than I think a lot of us realize. So thank you so much for coming to town and sharing your knowledge with us.
It's an absolute honor and a joy. As soon as I stepped off the plane, I fell in love with the Pacific Northwest. Indiana tends to be rather flat, and just to see a mountain, I was like, oh my God, I'm moving here. And so it really is a pleasure. I was fortunate to see the concert with Symphony Tacoma over the weekend, and just blown away, but also like everyone around the country and the world, to be able to do it in person and connect with the community that we've been so disconnected from by no fault of our own is just, you could tell, it was a treat for everyone on stage and in the audience, and that's why we do this, right? Yeah. At least that's why I'm in it. So it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Now, Joshua, you are a music sociologist, but you're also a performer.
Yes.
And you're one of the ways by which you are known on stage is Sock Joplin.
That's right.
I see you brought your socks.
I did.
Could you tell us a little bit about Sock Joplin?
Yeah. So Sock Joplin came from a nickname from the community in Indianapolis that I'm from, deriving from Scott Joplin, right? We know him as the father of ragtime, but he scored several really amazing pieces. I'm reminded of the Tremonisha Overture. And so it's kind of a play on words with that. I never play or perform with my shoes on because I practice this way. And it's a wonderful way to bring levity and personality to an industry and a field that sometimes feels so distant and so highbrow. And I am not a highbrow person. I play the part very well. But then also personally for me, it reminds me to have fun with what we're doing. Take what you do seriously, but don't take yourself so seriously. And regardless of what's ever on my program, I really encourage and try to foster for the community and the audience that same type of, we're just here together, it's just music. And it's fun. So if nothing else, if you don't like the program, my socks are always on point. So that helps.
Well, I can tell in the podcast that you and your co-host just have a complete ball.
We do.
And there's a lot of banter and talk and laughter. And then suddenly things get serious. And we're talking about real people who wrote great music,
yes,
and whose works are just not known. And so there's this sense of being kind of brought in through laughter and then leaving with this sense of, oh my gosh, there's a big world out there I don't know anything about. So you pique our curiosity and make us go find these people, which is fantastic.
That's the point. My co-host is the internationally renowned operatic soprano, Angela Brown. As she says, she's above the fold of the New York Times. She premiered at the Metropolitan Opera in 2004 as Aida. And that was just the beginning for her. She does so many wonderful things on stage around the world and in the community. We have a very family type experience with each other. That's our culture. Black culture is everybody's a cousin, everybody's an auntie. And so she's Auntie Angela. I like to Trojan horse people. We can talk about very serious things and necessary things, but we can bring a sense of community and family with it. And sometimes that's talking about classical music and social issues on the nose, and other times it's letting the music just do that for us. And it's really about encouraging our global audience to scratch that spirit of inquiry that I had myself, to find out for their own and to be a part of what we want to see, this transformation and this change and this broadening of audiences and engagement in classical music, and honestly within and between other genres as well. I think that's how classical music gets the freedom and the permission to evolve, and the people who contribute to this too. That's how we have to do it. So yeah.
So let's talk a little bit now about the piece in question. It's coming up on the Symphony Tacoma concert, which is the Second Symphony of Joseph de Bologne. This person is like out of a novel that's a bit over the top. It's like out of an opera, right? I mean, it's as though LeBron James played for the LA Lakers on Saturday night, and on Sunday at noon he's conducting the LA Philharmonic. Oh, and then he flies to the White House and plays chamber music with Jill Biden. That's who we're talking about.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about Joseph Bologne and about the Parisian culture in which he operated.
Absolutely. I tell you, so I'm the part where I would love to talk about Parisian culture as it fits into this global context. I'm going to pitch it to you, the biographical of this gentleman, because you're right, he is very much a center stage and intrepid and just interesting, fascinating character. So I'll handle the social context. Away with the things.
Well, my first introduction to this composer was by the unfortunate nickname that he has been given, which we need to move past now, which is the Black Mozart. Yeah. Obviously, there are parallels in certainly they lived at the same time. They're very much contemporaries. Mozart in Vienna and Joseph Bologne in Paris. Mm-hmm. Also, things in common, such as being a child prodigy performer and things like that, conductor, composer, and yet just that nickname kind of gets at what we're talking about here, which is we don't need to only think about Black composers in terms of how they compare to white composers, but this was an example of a fully fledged career of his own. Highly successful conductor in Paris, very accepted by the Parisian musical establishment, brilliant violinist, wonderful composer.
Fencer.
Fencer, yes, champion fencer.
There's a LeBron James there. Yeah. It's like the basketball of the era. Yes, right?
It's said that he was the best fencer in Europe. Mm-hmm. John Adams, our John Adams, apparently just said, this guy is so good that in the middle of a match, he can hit any button on your coat that he wants to. So he was like a LeBron James. He's kind of an astonishing athlete in all kinds of things, particularly fencing. Mm-hmm. Oh, and by the way, he's a virtuoso violinist and conductor and composer.
Yes.
And born in Guadeloupe.
Yes.
Right? Tell us about his family.
So this totally kind of like tests everyone's, global geography. So Guadeloupe is part of the French West Indies, right? And that location is wildly important for his upbringing in the social context, because this is still the dominant trade in global market economy, is the global slave trade. So these are individuals, enslaved peoples from predominantly West Africa, who are quite literally being commodified and being traded at the same level as tea. We think about the Bombay British Tea Company, as salt. And so it is the actual commodification of Black bodies. There's a price tag. You are a unit, and you have a price tag. You are not a person. And so that's why this is so fun to highlight him, because, man, when we reduce people to economies of scale, we miss out on such a big part of who they are, what gifts that they offer. But he's this wonderful intersectional representation of the complexities of the arts and culture movements, which includes the Enlightenment, which includes daring in composition, but also, like I said, the global economy and the advent and the return of democracy as being this dominant and idyllic way in which to rule in a republic. And the hypocrisies are buttressed up against each other, so glaringly so, and yet we usually only look at one side of that coin. So this is why I get super nerdy and geeky about where he fits in this whole context, because it's absolutely fascinating to me. Absolutely fascinating.
So he's got a white French father. Mm-hmm. His mother was an enslaved, Senegalese woman.
From Senegal, yes.
And then they all moved to Paris. So he's a mixed race person. His father is close to the court and therefore gets sort of perks for his kid. Mm-hmm. His kid has these natural abilities that are nurtured, and this kind of astonishing, a polymath, right? Somebody who is just astonishingly good at multiple things. Yeah. And we know, among other things, he takes over a chamber music group in Paris, and under the auspices of that, he personally, with his financial backers behind him, he personally corresponds with Joseph Haydn and commissions 6 symphonies, which Haydn writes, that we call the Paris Symphonies, in which he premiered. Right? I mean, this guy intersects with, and he also lived under the same house under the same roof with Mozart for about 6 months. How is it possible this is not one of the more famous people in late 18th century Europe?
Right, and of course we know why.
Yes.
It's getting back to exactly what you're talking about. It is just the color of his skin, and that story being a complex one that isn't easy to tell to young people interested in learning about classical music, in the same way we love to tell stories of Mozart and Beethoven and other great figures of classical music history.
He's also sitting at this, and this is something that becomes unique to, I would say, to Europe, and especially when we get to like Central and South America, as opposed to the United States. This is, it's the intersection of class as well. So yes, he's mixed race, he has that, but because of the way that the courts and the magistrates are set up, there is a lot more social mobility and acumen and agency that he is able to foster and to take advantage of, and he absolutely does. We see this happening again in the 1920s and 1930s in America, where you're looking at the prominent, black folks who are performing. They can't do it here, so where do they go? Paris. They go to Europe, right, where we can walk in the same door as our other European contemporaries. This is the same thing, but class does have its limitations because he's very visibly in a skin that coins can't take care of. We're looking at the time of Voltaire and Rousseau. These are the ideas of democracy. It's everything, order, reason, and balance. Our republic is formed on these with John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. The French Revolution is modeled after our own. And here we have these wonderful ideals. All men are created equal unless, unless, and that's what it is. So he's still he's very much of his time, socially and musically. He's very much of this time in the 21st century. He's very much a wonderful individual, his life and his music being these musical scores to this trajectory of tracing our progress, our lack thereof, or this very circular narrative and international behavior that we do between race and class, between who belongs in the canon, who does not, and sometimes maybe our reticence to elevate individuals and oversample and overrepresent others. So yes, there's layers to all of this.
There is.
Very fun, very complex.
And the French Revolution, we know that he was kind of a chamber musician to Marie Antoinette herself, played violin while she played the keyboard, because she was a very good musician.
Absolutely.
So she's very close to the court, and yet, after 1789, French Revolution, he joins the revolutionary forces, leads a group of soldiers, right?
Yes.
So again, which class, how complicated can you get?
I look at it, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, it is survival. That's survival. There's a reason why, fortunately, he was born, a genius. This is, I think, the wonderful way that the universe corrects itself, born into a set of circumstances that are just absolutely abject by no of his own. And the way that the universe balances that is, look what he does. Look who he is. Welcome to the wonderful counterbalance. It's survival. From my culture, as a black African-American, at a very young age, we are raised, you must be twice as good in order to get half the credit or to be seen. This is survival for him. He doesn't have choice, right? He's got agency in class. He's got access that a lot of folks in contemporaries his age don't. In his lifetime, he has a modicum of freedom where others are literally, enslaved and shackled and at ports and being sold and like horses, their property, where that's not necessarily his complete lot in life. And I've just always wondered where class and race, where it actually becomes, where we do have to be a little bit more innovative and excel at everything that we do, because where one door closes, you got to have so many other windows. Let's look at female composers in classical music. Let's look at other cultures as well outside of a dominant culture. Is it not the same pathology that we have as survival? That's just what we do. Would you agree with?
I would.
Yeah. No, that's what I think.
Yeah. Well, I encourage people to go to YouTube and find lots of videos of this man's music.
Yes.
The Symphony No. 2, which Symphony Tacoma will play, you can find multiple performances of it. It's not very long. It's 11 minutes long, something like that. But I would like to suggest that people particularly look at the violin concertos.
Yes.
Maybe string quartets, because he was a violinist, and it's the concerto, the violin concerto in particular, which was his showpiece, right? He would write it for himself to play, and that's where you really see Joseph Bologna stretching out and showing his stuff.
Yes. I got to add too, because we've performed this and it's so wonderful, for the music educators out there, for the ones with young students who are at that advanced beginner, early intermediate, his Adagio in F minor for piano is absolutely fantastic. It's approachable, it is legitimate in its own right. It's going to teach folks how to really find that balance between melody and harmony. It's an accessible piece. This is something on those recitals from kindergarten all the way up through. Program the music. It's there. It's been sitting there for almost, 300 years at this point. So play it. And it's a divine piece. And so there's the virtuosity and the brilliance, and then there's also the brilliance and the basic and the accessible that we teach and we replicate. So he is a wonderful model for music education. Definitely is.
Fantastic. Well, Kim Davenport and Joshua Thompson, thank you so much for joining us. This is the deep stuff. We have to recognize that music may be perfectly delightful on a Saturday evening, but it was created by real people living in a real world, and oftentimes that real world was not very attractive. In fact, sometimes it was dangerous. Sometimes it was horrifyingly oppressive. And classical music was a part of all of that. One of my favorite videos of a Bologna performance is by a black orchestra from South Africa. You can find this on YouTube. And to see,
I have not seen
see
this.
those musicians playing with all of their passion, this piece written in Paris in the late 18th century is just something, it just makes me feel actually kind of good about the whole classical music scene, because it really can appeal to absolutely anybody around the globe that really devotes themselves to it. And to see that connection for those players through this amazing individual is just really unique and powerful.
That's the best promo I can think of to say, you can find yourself in this music, and what a wonderful thing it is when you do find yourself in these compositions. It makes it way more personable, and there's that story that's able to convey to an audience of any age, of any style, of any class, that we're all out here. We all have something to contribute, and listening is contribution as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a sincere honor to meet and work with both of you. I say thank you so much, and enjoy the show. It is a phenomenal program from start to finish. So I'll be tuning into that one too.
All right. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you.
All right, well, I am now being joined by Maestra Sarah Ioannides, and we're going to continue this discussion talking about some details about the Bologna Symphony No. 2, as well as the other pieces on the program. So, welcome, Maestra Sarah.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see you again.
That was a really fun conversation with Kim and Joshua. It reminds us that all the pieces that we hear on a symphony orchestra concert are written by real people living real lives in a real world. And of course, one of the things that makes music history so fascinating is thinking about who were these people? Why did they write what they wrote? So let's dive in a little bit now to the actual piece, Symphony No. 2. Why did you choose that? Maybe you want to start, in fact, by sort of talking about the concept for the whole program, but let it lead into what is this piece we're going to hear at the opening?
Great. Well, the concept for the whole program was to have something that would really shape around our wonderful soloist Mary Jensen being a feature. And sometimes I program in mind with the symphony first in my head and then what's going to work with it. But sometimes I also think about the soloist and what will frame it nicely. We have a slightly smaller contingent of the orchestra for a chamber orchestra setting, let's say. And so it was really finding the right pieces that fit both the flavor and balance. So when I talked to Mary, it was what would you like to play? And here's some choices that we had. And then, of course, we look at our instrumentation limitations, all that kind of thing. And I was interested in the Fauré, and she was also interested in the Mozart, and because they're relatively short, they pair really well together, and they also diverge. And then there's all these parallels of them being based around Paris, basically. There's some coincidence. So some coincidence, of course, comes out, but also a little bit of organization of that coincidence.
I think I probably just assumed that you had Paris in mind at the beginning, because the program fits together so beautifully around Paris. We have the Paris of Bologna and Mozart. Mozart, you know, of course, we associate him with Vienna, but he spent several sojourns in Paris, once when he was a little tiny kid, and then once when he was about 20 or so with his mom, when he was writing these pieces, right? And when he was under the same roof with Joseph de Bologne for a few months.
Who was senior to him.
Yes, oh
and
yes.
Who I think there's a story even that Joseph thought that Mozart actually copied some of his concerto, and there's literally a quote where it's almost exactly the same passage, and quite likely that Mozart heard Joseph de Bologne's music.
And Mozart, like all good composers, was constantly writing down other people's music, not to steal it, but to figure out how this was so good. How do you do this? Bach did this, right? Haydn did this, Beethoven, everybody does this. And so to write down a great tune from a great composer that the audience really likes, it's a very composer thing to do. And then, you know, either, I mean, you might quote it, you might paraphrase it, or you might even homage it, right? I mean, if the Parisian audience knew this piece by this famous composer Bologna, right, they might say, oh, that's a quote from Bologna, good idea. But anyway, so tell us a little bit about the piece itself, the Symphony No. 2 by Bologna. How many movements, sort of what is its style, that sort of thing?
It's a fairly traditional classical music style. It's a very, very short symphony. It's for strings. It's 3 movements in that traditional sense. The middle movement, a slower Andante, and the last movement with a lot more flair. It's quite typical of the kind of thing that you might hear Haydn, for example, right? But with a little bit more unpredictable timings, tempos, and a few surprises thrown in, and that's akin to the kind of style at the time, which was a Sturm und Drang, which was something that was an effect that was written to deliberately surprise or shock the audience. So he uses that somewhat. Thinking of something you were saying just earlier, I was reminded of the composers taking other composers and bringing them forward. And one thing about this program is we not only capture the classical era of Mozart when he's in Paris, taking the commission for the flute concertos, but we also have 2 French composers somewhat 150 years later with Ravel and Fauré. And there's that relationship between Fauré and Ravel, because Ravel studied with Fauré along with Nadia Boulanger and some other wonderful composers. But there was also about a similar age difference between Mozart and, I'm going to call him Le Chevalier, the Knight of Saint-Georges, between Fauré and Ravel. And so Ravel, when he writes, is looking back also in time to Couperin, another French composer, back to the earlier, late 17th century, and to a style of performance that is similar for French suites, for piano suites of the time, and takes some of those movements. Originally it was a piano work, but it was orchestrated later. And it also is about people, because he's commissioned each movement to somebody who died in the First World War. So, I'm thinking also about the parallel with Chevalier de Saint-Georges having to go off to war and fight and bring a troop together. And so there was a lot of tragedy at that time, as we know, going into not only the First World War, but also the French Revolution. So we have to remember that all of these composers, there is imminent danger around them on a permanent basis. You just never know what's going to happen. So a composer's ability to shock and do something different and break new ground for future composers was quite significant. I think being on the cusp of breaking out and being able to gain a new audience or an attraction was really part of the point, as Haydn did it. Mozart did it perhaps less to a degree, but Fauré liked, even though we don't think of him as a particularly daring composer, he liked to break out of the norm in a more subtle, careful, quiet way. but he definitely does it.
Yeah.
Surprises.
Fauré is one of those characters that we kind of credit with helping to launch what we call Impressionism, right? A lot of Fauré's subtle revolutions had to do with going back to medieval church modes and things like that, which Ravel then soaked up and sort of helped, along with Debussy, to create French Impressionism. I'm going to say that the other thing that we could draw a parallel here is that when we think of symphonic music, 19th century, we often, I mean, there are lots of Germans involved, right? Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, and etc. But the French, of course, were always there, and it does always seem as though the French are searching for a way to be French musicians, not just more Germans, right? And so Mozart noticed this when he came to Paris. He was a very Germanic composer, came to Paris and immediately started talking about French style. And when he wrote his own Paris symphony, he tried very hard to imitate it so that the French audience would like his piece. And he succeeded. It's a great piece. But yeah, so in the same way then, Fauré, after the Franco-Prussian War, 1870, you know, the whole generation of people saying, how can we be French rather than German? And someone like Debussy, I mean, very much kind of helps invent the musical revolution that is Impressionism and ultimately modernism by sort of actively trying to do whatever the Germans don't do, right?
Yes. And I think
and going back to the French Baroque, like Couperin, right? Early 18th century composer, for inspiration rather than trying to be Beethoven.
Right. And it was the epicenter of what was most interesting at the time in the late 19th century. It was the place to be. And so anybody was going to Paris. And I think that already started at this time when Mozart was already there and Joseph de Boulogne was also there. Yeah. Things were happening there. And it probably for 100 years, I mean, the Paris Conservatoire was a big place. And Fauré, of course, was the head of composition at the conservatory at that time. Yeah. And from that being born, composers like Lily and Nadia Boulanger, very important women French composers coming out. There's so much we still have to uncover from what was going on behind the scenes. I mean, the Chevalier is just one example, but there's so much more to still uncover.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. This concert is just going to be wonderfully interesting. I mean, I can't wait to hear this succession of pieces in this order. You know, moving from Joseph Bologna, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, on through the Mozart, and then the Fauré, and then the Ravel, which, as you say, ends up being these kind of portrait pieces about friends of his who died during the World War I. I mean, the concert just ties together sort of Europe for about 150 years.
There's an interesting contrast here with the two works that Mary is going to play, and I think she's going to play a little bit for us on this music mixer as well. But we have two pieces that are sort of the slow and then the faster, you know, the Andante and Rondo by Mozart. I thought I'd talk just a little bit about that. But then also the Fauré, which is also an Andante sostenuto and then a faster allegro. So these pieces in some ways, I'm interested to hear what Mary has to say about them, because they're kind of polar opposites. One was written and commissioned by a Dutch amateur flautist who wanted, you know, several concertos to be written for him, but not too difficult, and the request was that they were easily manageable. He didn't particularly like the original second movement of the first flute concerto, so he wanted Mozart to write a new one. And then you've got this other piece, the Rondo, which actually wasn't written for the flute that we're playing, but flautists often pair these two together. It's written for the violin and transposed into the key of C so that they go really well together. So that makes an interesting pairing. The second half, it was written for a competition. So the Fauré is a Fantasie. It's to show a lot of espressivo style, a lot of contrast. There's beautiful kind of minor ninths and juicy harmonies mixed into the music. But then there's also this very, very technical, audacious vivace kind of style of second movement. So we get to see Mary in all of this plaintive, easier style of Andante, which is just nothing is easy really, but not quite as technically challenged, as opposed to something that was written for a flute competition, which Fauré churned out for that. He said actually it was one of the most challenging things he ever did was to write something like this for a flute concerto. So it'll be interesting to hear from Mary how it is to play these very different works.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. Well, that's a lot of great detail to know, and why pieces are written. What is the reason behind it? What is the function it's supposed to fulfill? A competition versus something for an amateur player to play. This makes all the difference in the world for a composer.
Fun fact: Mozart, he got paid. He was offered 200 florins to write 3 flute concertos and a number of other auxiliary works for flute and maybe chamber music by Ferdinand, Dutch flautist. And you know how much that would be today? That'd be about $7,000. So he was teaching it. This was at a time where he was not in his posts anymore. He was actually freelancing, and he was doing most of his income was through teaching. So, there's always a story about Mozart didn't really like writing for the flute, and we think it actually was an excuse because he was late on a project, and his dad was kind of ringing him, not literally, but on his back. He says, "Come on, Dad, it's the flute. What do you expect? It's not." But he writes so beautifully for the flute, and the flute and harp concerto is another simply gorgeous one. And I think during this time there's really a revolution of flute playing, because of course we know it initially as a pipe that everybody could play, could blow into. But at this time, flute writing just begins to get more and more creative and interesting. So I think Mozart did like the flute. This music says so, I think.
It would certainly seem so to me.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, it's going to be exciting, and we'll turn to Mary and get some thoughts from her on her part as the performer and her take on these pieces, both from Mozart and Fauré. All right, so let's now close out this mixer by listening to Mary perform one of these pieces for us this evening, and we will see you at the Pantages on November 20.
Hi everyone, I am so happy to stop in and say hi and to be a part of this preview for our upcoming concert. It is always wonderful to be a featured soloist with any ensemble, but it is an especially exciting experience to solo with my home orchestra. Also, a very interesting and exciting aspect of this performance is to be able to share 2 complementary yet contrasting concertos with you. I'm looking forward to seeing you all for some Mozart and Fauré on November 20th. And now for a little Mozart. you on November 20th.